Do you want to start?
The Dellasegas, born and raised Catholic. The faith that Mom and Dad portrayed by example was amazing growing up. Great memories of Sunday Mass, and then go home for a big meal, and usually a nap in the afternoon, and then we'd play all afternoon and evening in the big backyard. So the faith that Mom and Dad portrayed, and Grandma and Grandpa, was something that I think all of our family strives to be like. Yeah, I had a lot of opportunities in my life to practice patience and endurance, and Grandma Irene has a saying, it is what it is, and I think that's something that we definitely lived by. So a couple of those things, as I was going into college, I broke my wrist. After the surgery, I still remember my dad asking, will he ever be able to throw again? And the doctor said, he may not even be able to move his wrist just a ½ inch. And so that was a definite bump in the road. I still remember the positiveness of the family and the faith that everything's gonna work out. So it was gonna be a long recovery, where I was gonna be probably out that whole year. And I remember reporting to K-State, and at that time, it was definitely the hardest, year or time of my life. And I remember one of the coaches saying, you should have just went to junior college. That actually probably helped fuel the motivation even more. That was something that, getting told you can't do something is sometimes helps you go accomplish it. And so ended up staying there and kind of pushing through it, and then getting to the last couple years there, I'm really glad I did. Ended up to be just a great experience that I can go back to. So through these different life events, I go back to what Grandma Irene said a lot of, it is what it is. That's one of her sayings that we relate back to regularly. Another one, that I guess, I said, probably didn't even realize it on the way home, was it's just a bump in the road. So those are a couple things that, going through some of the things that we went through, as well as we've really taken those and ran with them. So the night we met, actually, I was not invited to her party. My brother I was living with, and also a friend, Charles Merschman, I was living with, and both of them were going to a potluck dinner. They were like, yeah, why don't you come with us? We actually don't have any food to bring to a potluck, but we got there, and so there was, probably 20 or 25 people there, and happened to, sit down by her, and we played a board game, and we, had dinner, and I remember just having a real good time. And then the next day, we decided to have a couple people over to our house, and Charles had known Sarah, and so I said, Charles, make sure that Sarah is there as well. So,
it was just really smooth dating. Conversation was easy. We were on the same page with things, and I think fairly early on, we both kind of knew where it was headed. And before we got married, there was kind of a question around fertility due to some health concerns, and during our engagement process, we just decided that we were going to just put it in God's hands. And I specifically remember Daniel and I sitting down not long after we got married, and we were reading about the Annunciation about Mary's yes. And I said, let's always just be ready to say yes, whenever he asks us, to be open to children. And sure enough, about a couple weeks later, 2 weeks later, we had a positive pregnancy test.
So I had never really seen a sonogram, so I wasn't 100% sure what I was looking for. She was a little bit more certain, but...
Well, and she was circling, she had labeled things A and B and was making circles on the screen, and I just kind of asked her, what do those circles mean? And without even looking at us, she just kept going and was like, oh, there's 2. And I looked at Daniel, and
You're having 2.
We were just to what? We were just so speechless. And
very nonchalant from the technician, and we definitely changed our lives.
So pregnancy with the twins was going well, and then at 25 weeks, I just had a feeling something just didn't feel right. So I actually called our nurse, Sandy, and asked her to, what I should do, and she said to go in and just make sure everything was good. And when I got to the hospital, I found out that I was in preterm labor, and they said that we had to slow it down or they would be delivered early. So Daniel came up to the hospital and they started us on some different medications and things, and we're actually able to stop it, within like 48 hours. And however, at that point I was too far along to go home. So I had to stay in the hospital until they were gonna come. And so we were trying to hold it off as long as we could, since every day I sat in bed was 2 days they don't have to sit in the NICU. So we sat there for 60 days on bed rest, and until they decided to come. And they were born at 33 weeks and they were healthy. They didn't need to be on ventilators or anything like that.
A couple things about the experience for me was the day that we got there, and in the small little room there was probably 20 medical professionals saying that these babies are probably coming tonight. So that was a very scary experience, and we were not prepared for it. But it was one of the examples that it was, it is what it is, and try to move forward from there. So I remember it was probably, I don't know, maybe a week or two in, and she was, bed rest the whole time. And it was, definitely a challenging time. My Captain's Men group came up, and it just so happened that morning she got up as I was walking out, and she was, crying a little bit. And she said something to the effect of, I never really understood in the Mass when it said, "This is my body which is given up for you." That hit home for me as just her sacrificial love with the twins, and then the experience of, going and sharing that with the Captain's Men group and praying with them, and was something that I'll never forget.
So 16 months after the twins, we had third child, Grace, and even, with all the precautions that we took, us had a separate complication, and she came at 23 weeks, which is the earliest that they can come and survive. And so
Dr. Crispin walked in and saw the monitors, and her heart rate had dipped, and he was like, "We need to take her now." I just remember that we got there, and within probably 10 or 15 minutes of when we got there, Grace had been delivered. We figured out 2 or 3 days later that the complications, if it would have been another 5 or 10 minutes, maybe a little bit longer than that, Grace probably wouldn't have made it, and actually Sarah wouldn't have made it as well through some of the complications that she had. So the timing of everything was, I don't know, I'd have to call it miraculous with how everything went.
Throughout the entire time Grace was in the NICU, it was a very challenging time for Daniel and I. You can't prepare for that. You can't, prepare to watch your child dying every day. And so, you're kind of on information overload as far as the things that they're going through, and you can't touch them. All you can do is look at them. And so I think adapting that attitude that it is what it is, really is probably what kept us sane, and really is probably what helped sustain our faith, because every time something would happen to her, we would just, calmly say, "Well, she's here." And so there were seizures and potential, there was a question of whether she could see or not. And I always remember thinking, oh, none of that matters, like, she's here. And so I think it's in situations like that you learn what you're made of, but you also learn that you have very little control, and it's really about just handing it over and saying, if this is what you've given me, then this is what we're gonna do. And Grace really is a miracle, and it was amazing to me how a 1 pound baby can touch so many lives. She was 1 pound 6 ounces when she was born, and she brought so many people to their knees. It's just the power that God uses. A small baby that came from our yes to change the world. And I really think that, Grace has taught us, to try to trust God, and even though that's a hard thing to do sometimes.
Yeah, so the twins definitely helped prepare us for the NICU stay with Grace. We kind of knew what to expect a little bit. The strength to get through everything. You kind of went back to everything that had happened in my life, be it with some of the small bumps in the road. There wasn't another choice. The whole time we were there, people were kind of asking, how you did it with the twins at home and everything, and we just kind of looked at each other and said, the faith that we have been passed along from our family was one big thing. And then also the amazing amount of prayers from our friends and families. You know, we would get regular texts and phone calls and emails with the support from the community and from our family, which was overwhelming. And
I think too, like as you're saying, like your strength and the moments when you feel like you can't pray come from the faith in the community around you, you know, in the mystical body of Christ, and in the you know, you really start to understand like how the church militant and the church in heaven and church triumphant, you know, how it all works together. Because when you're in that, and sometimes you don't feel like you can find the words to pray, and in that moment, you know, you rely on your church to hold you up too.
So meekness to me, you know, I think sometimes the world defines it as being weak, or somebody that's timid, whereas I would think it's the opposite, as, you know, somebody that's filled with the Holy Spirit, that's vibrant, but also, you know, have the humility. I think of meekness more and the examples of Father Capon and Jesus more as being comfortable in your own skin, you know, being kind of knowing where you're at, knowing where you're going, knowing where you want to go. That inner strength, the humble confidence to not necessarily, you know, be overbearing and overpowering, but to be able to be the leader within your community and within your faith.
Father John, the quiet leadership and strength of Daniel Dellasega is remarkable. He doesn't even seem to recognize it, which is a lot like Father Capon.
Absolutely. One of Father Capon's homilies, he speaks about the analogy of being the good shepherd. And remember earlier in the series we talked about my life is not my own, but Father Capon knew who he was, and he was not afraid to show that example. And he recognized that he was to be a shepherd. And a shepherd, as Father Capon said, just goes about his duty doing what a shepherd does, which is protecting and guiding and feeding the sheep. But he does so in a quiet way, and that's certainly the way that we see in this story that we had just witnessed, as well as in Father Capon's life and in the lives of many of the saints. The humility, but it also requires courage. While the shepherd has a responsibility, at times the shepherd has to be courageous enough to stand up against the enemy, whether that be someone trying to steal a sheep or a wolf that may come to the pasture. So that aspect of being strong is not an antithesis of meekness being weak. Does that make sense? Oftentimes people think blessed are the meek, and meek is seen as weak. No, to be meek is to be strong. And I think Father Capon certainly witnessed that in the way in which he lived his life. I'd like, if you don't mind, to share a passage of what St. Paul says. This is in the 4th chapter of his letter to the Ephesians. Paul writes, "I then, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to live in a manner worthy of the call you have received, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another through love." Again, what did we talk about right at the very beginning? That the whole journey in this life is to return to God, and God is love. But that we, like St. Paul here, and this is what I find fascinating about this passage, Father Capon was a prisoner for the Lord. And of course, his was in a prisoner of war camp in Pyeongtaung. But Paul was a prisoner, but he urges us to what? Live in a manner worthy of the call you have received. Remember, this is about vocation. And we spoke about that in the very introduction of this series. Placed within the vocation to be persons of beatitude is that we're following Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life, who leads us to the Father. No one comes to the Father except through me. Father Capon was a priest. He was a priest of Jesus Christ, and he knew that he was called to be a shepherd, to lead with meekness, to lead with strength, to lead with courage.
Courage, love, humility. These really describe the domestic church that Daniel so beautifully modeled for us during that session. The challenge this week is to go home to that domestic church and to be that example to your family. This week we're asking you to do one thing that you generally don't do, not for attention and not to be celebrated, but a thing that your family will see or notice that you've done that will draw attention to the fact that you live in the Beatitudes. So that when they begin to pray about what it means to be a Capons man, your children and your spouse can begin to see it's not just words or meetings, it's a way of life where we take our guide, Father Capon, and we live fully into the Beatitudes as a community of faith as we accompany each other on this journey.